Hello, my name is TSHIDI Madia from Team Eyewitness News. So, no, the focus this week is not about local politics, not South African in a sense. We're going to cast our eyes further away. We're going to cast our eyes to the United States. America is holding its 60th presidential elections, hoping to vote in its 47th president. That election is interesting for multiple reasons, and I'll get to them. You'll realize why you and I here at the southernmost tip of Africa should be bothered, or at least be paying some attention to what the Americans are doing. They call these elections existential to some degree, the different sides that is. Some will say to you that democracy in the US is definitely on the ballot. Let me help you understand what I understand about those elections. Number one, there is no IEC. So in South Africa, you have this overarching body, this independent electoral commission that handles and oversees and makes sure we are able to cast our votes in a free and fair manner. They don't necessarily have that. Each state in America is responsible for what happens in that particular state around the elections. They do the counting themselves, minus maybe one or two states, that is. But then there's a question of scrutiny, right? An election this hotly contested, because it is, one does not want to make a mistake. And I think if you pay attention, there are tons and tons of lawyers across different states around all manner of electoral officials, making sure that they're keeping their eyes on those ballots, keeping an eye on those votes, looking out for one discrepancy, one issue that they will challenge. So this, for me, is likely to be a highly litigious process. The election results, unlike ours, also don't necessarily come out immediately. We vote, we head off to the IEC, watch that big board and watch the numbers tally up. Not so much. The Americans will be looking at polls and newscasters for direction. The newscasters have put it down to a science, if you may, in the US, in terms of following the elections, and they will follow it to the T, and that's where you will figure out who's likely to become America's president-elect. That president, mind you, will not get inaugurated now. That runway is also quite long, unlike ours. Theirs will last all the way until January. I believe the inauguration, if things go well, is likely to end up happening on the 20th of January 2025. That's when the new president will take over. Now, I do need to speak about the presidential candidates, don't I? And how one becomes a president. There are two front runners, really. Two-party system is what you're dealing with in America. An extremely polarized nation. We've said it. I've been there and I've literally spoken to people, either you're red or blue. Very seldom do you find people in the middle in the US. You've got the Republicans, right, the GOP, and then you also have the blue party, the Democrats. The Republicans' nominee for presidency this year is Donald Trump, yes. He who's flamboyant, he who's twice impeached, he with multiple indictments across multiple states. That's the best person that the Republican Party has put forward as its presidential candidate. This, of course, is Donald Trump's third try. He was successful on his first try, unsuccessful in 2020, which led to that January insurrection, but we'll talk about that one much, much later. This is his third go. There's lots of talk already being peppered by his supporters that if he doesn't get his way, something will go wrong in the US. So lots of threats and fears and tensions that speak to what South Africans in the US have been telling me, that they do feel a sense of anxiety. The picture being painted for me is that this is an election of the unknown. You also happen to have Kamala Harris, the first mixed race woman who could become America's president. Hillary Clinton tried it back in 2016. It didn't work. Kamala is a latecomer. She wasn't necessarily the initial pick. Joe Biden, the incumbent, had attempted to make another run. But everybody, I should hope, remembers the disastrous debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. After that, he dropped out of the race. Kamala became the candidate. And I think she's made lots of headway. If you're paying attention to the polls, they are literally neck and neck. And she's pushed ahead of him in areas like Iowa, which are recognized often as traditional red states, Republicans. So an interesting picture is emerging in the US at the moment. Over 100 million Americans are eligible to vote. And of that 100 million, we're already seeing 70 million having cast their ballots. An interesting picture for me around voters has got to be around those who are naturalized. I think this year is producing the most highest number of naturalized citizens will be eligible to vote. So migrants, South Africans are among the list from multiple countries who've made America their home and are able to cast their votes. The other interesting picture for me has got to be around the women, and that's tied to the issue of reproduction, but I'll come back to that a little bit later on. I want to speak to you a little bit more about how a president is elected. Unlike South Africa, where our parliament elects a president, in America, you've got this thing called an electoral college, right? You might need 270 electoral college votes to make a determination of who becomes president. 270, but that doesn't necessarily translate to 270 votes. It's 270 electors, right, representing different states. Different districts and different states might have more numbers of votes in that electoral college depending on how big they are. There's also where you find the conversation around the swing states coming into play. There are around 7 states that have been picked as crucial battlegrounds. If you've been watching US elections, what you've been seeing is the non-stop movement of either Harris's team or Trump's back and forth in particular areas: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These are the swing states that could go either way. I was in Nevada earlier in the year. Nevada tends to swing blue, and people in Nevada will tell you that Nevada's hardly gotten an election wrong, that whichever direction it swings this year, that's likely to be whoever seals the presidential race. For voters living in those states, I think they cannot breathe without being sold a leader or the other. South African journalist Nick Dawes, living in New York, explains how much money is pumped into these campaigns.
This campaign is probably the most intensely digital that we've ever seen, but there's also been a huge air war of TV ads and, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on TV ads. And if you live in a swing state, you are just bombarded on a constant basis. So the scale of money in these campaigns is the first thing I would note. You have never seen anything like it as a South African, to imagine how much is being spent.
Another thing that makes the American elections very unique from ours is that issues can actually find their way in the ballot. So in the wake of Wade v. Roe, you might have heard concerns around reproductive rights, where women do not want men having a say about what must happen with their bodies or their rights to abort if that's what they want to do. So this particular matter in some states is literally on the ballot paper. So if you're in Florida, you're in New York, you're in Nevada, you'll have to make a decision of whether or not you're for or against whatever's been proposed, the amendments that is, as far as reproductive rights are concerned. At the same time, there is the Middle East conflict. This is quite interesting in how it's found expression in the US. It's the morality question, and it's one that I think most Democrats grapple with more than the Republicans. The conservatives are quite clear about who Trump is, where he stands, his relationship with Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's simple. But the struggle that Democrats are having is a question of recognizing what happens in Palestine as a genocide and then being forced to then vote for someone, Kamala Harris, who endorses, who has not shied away from supporting what Israel is doing in Palestine. So that's a conflict that many have spoken to us saying that they battle with every day as they make decisions about what the way forward is for the US. This has deeply divided the Democratic vote.
I can say that I have at least a sliver of a hope that she will, once in power, be able to be at least more nuanced in her response to what is happening in Palestine. It's not just what is happening in Gaza. It has been the American policy towards Palestine from day one, basically. And being in the West Bank and seeing the terror that people are living under, I really cannot legitimize even voting in the way that I did, except to say that I believe that the other option would be worse for the people of Palestine, for us here in this country, and for people around the world.
Ultimately, what the Americans are viewing these elections as is fundamental rights versus Donald Trump and his promise of economic prosperity and protectionism that will happen when he attempts to make America great one more time. Another thing that makes these elections an unknown factor for me is whether or not January 6th, the attempted insurrection, will be a factor once again. If you listen to Trump or his supporters, they're threatening all manner of things. They're saying they will not accept the results if they don't favor Trump's return to the White House. Some people will tell you that America is not a violent society. The fact that the insurrection happened and the fact that there's continuing violence and concerns that remain is telling in and of itself. For us as South Africans, I think you do need to look at our relationship with the Americans, and it's had a fair share of tensions itself over the past year. Of course, with our stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as, of course, what's happening in the Middle East, particularly our decision to approach the ICJ. One can make an argument that as far as things like AGOA, the trade aspect of our relationship, that things will remain more the same if Harris emerges as a winner. Supposedly there'll be a continuation. There is an argument that you actually don't know what you'll get if Trump emerges as the victor. Will he wake up and decide that South Africa doesn't belong in AGOA? Is it important to rectify AGOA? I always make the argument around AGOA that it's cutting your nose to spite your face. That's something that the Americans will also have to think about. They've got to be able to think about what do they benefit from relations with this country, this region, this continent. There are grave concerns about those relationships, and even greater concerns about how will the Middle East be handled if a Donald Trump emerges as the victor at the end of all of this. Americans, vote this week.